Hello, welcome once again to Bateman's. 2 years ago we filmed a tour of the interior of the house and the nearer parts of the garden. Today we're going to visit some of the further parts of the estate, including the mill, where we'll see a demonstration of it in action. Then we'll walk up to the village, where we'll see Kipling's statue, the War Memorial, and end in St Bartholomew's Church. So sit back and please enjoy the tour. We begin our tour in the Rose Garden, where John Walker will tell us about two Jacobean statues.
We're in the Rose Garden, an area that any visitor to Bateman's finds delightful, and it was designed to be that. Remember that a lot of the expense necessary to build the Rose Garden and the pool came from the money which came to Kipling from the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1907. But we're here particularly to talk about the two statues because, well, mainly because almost every visitor asks about them. They're really exactly right as they should be for the house. They're Jacobean, and some will tell you that they were specially commissioned by Kipling, but maybe I'm more inclined to think that they were spotted as very suitable. And then usually we go on to talk about them as representative of John and Elsie, of Dan and Una, or maybe of the Puck figure. And if you look closely at the male figure, you forget anything to do with a young boy. It's a quite grotesque man, whereas the girl's figure is pretty and thoughtful. And many of you will know that Elsie's nickname in the family was Bird. But you may not know that the full nickname was actually Bird of Ill Omen, because of her solemn expression on some occasions. And that's there for me in the girl of the two statues. It's a lovely place here, and the sort of area that every visitor should come back to and enjoy again. And very suitably at the end of the Rose Garden, but perhaps too shaded by the glorious hedges around it, we have the sundial. And if you come to it, you must manage to decipher, "It is later than you think." The kind of reminder that Kipling was to have again from time to time, and had already had in his home in America.
We're visiting Park Mill next, at the far end of the garden, where one of the National Trust volunteer millers, Paul Hawthorne, will tell us of its history.
A quick bit of history first. The mill was built between 1750 and 1753 and operated right up until the time that Kipling bought the house in 1902. Kipling was not interested in the mill as a mill, he was interested in the water supply. So by 1903 he'd taken the water wheel away and had installed his turbine so that he could have electricity in the house. It was 110 volt DC, powered 55 lead acid batteries kept up in the tea rooms. And they powered 10 60-watt light bulbs for about 4 hours each evening. And he used the turbine until about 1920, when he installed a little single-cylinder gas engine, presumably until Electricity arrived in Burwash around about 1930, 1931. But the mill itself then fell into total disrepair and stayed that way until the trust started restoring it in 1969, completed in 1975, and it started milling again in March 1975.
Next, we will hear from Russell Wakefield how the mill operates.
Park Mill is an example of an overshot mill where the water from the pond behind me comes over the water wheel outside and drives the mechanism downstairs. We're here with the grinding stones, which you can't quite see because they're covered in the wooden box, the ton, which protects from rubbish and dirt getting in and also stops the flour dust from filling this whole space. We have a hopper here that is loaded. Depending on how fast we're milling, the contents of this hopper will last for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and is refilled through this sock from a much larger bin upstairs that can hold about a ton of grain, potentially a day's worth of milling for a miller. This is controlled. This feed from the hopper goes into this stone, into the eye of the stone, through a shoe, which is agitated by what's called the damsel. That's a small iron triangular piece that agitates, keeps a nice steady flow of grain going into the eye. The stone is rotating by the machinery, can rotate us up to 200 revs per minute if necessary, but that's very fast. We're running a lot slower at this time. And we have controls here that allow us to vary the speed depending on the nature of the grain. We're milling wheat, but traditionally this could have milled barley or oats or any other type of grain. For each of these, and depending on the quality of the grain, the weather, you have to adjust it. There's no one size fits all on an old mill like this. Downstairs, the machinery comprises a large number of cogs driven by the water wheel. There is a pit wheel running vertically, which drives a wallower, which is an odd-shaped horizontal cog connected to a vertical shaft. This vertical shaft is then used to drive the stone nuts that drive the sets of stones. This mill has 3 sets, 2 of which are set up just as exhibits these days, but the one set we're milling. And that, at the miller's station downstairs, he has the controls for the quality of the flour that he's producing and the outflow from this hopper as the flour comes out to bag. Right, here, this is the miller's station where the miller has complete control over the quality of the flour that's being produced. You saw the milling stones and the ton upstairs. What you're looking at here is the pipe down which the flour comes into a final sock and is periodically emptied into a sack there, from which it will eventually be bagged up into the individual paper bags. Control here comprises what's called a tentering screw, which adjusts the spacing between the 2 stones upstairs. One can open it up for coarse flour, and that closes them down to produce very fine flour. For a large piece of machinery, the amount of control on here is remarkably little. Quarter turn will change from acceptable flour to unacceptably coarse. And in past times, the miller could run this mill completely on his own. He has controls here that also affect the speed at which the grain is fed into the hoppers upstairs. These days we always operate with 2 people rather than try and risk it with 1. And that's basically the operation.
The tour continued outside by the mill dam, where we had our first set of Kipling readings, commencing with a poem from David Forsyth.
I'm going to read the first 5 verses of Puck's song. See you the ferny ride that steals into the oak wood far? Oh, that was whence they hewed the keels that rolled to Trafalgar. And mark you where the ivy clings to Bayham's mouldering walls? Oh,
There we cast the stout railings that stand around St. Paul's. See you the dimpled track that runs all hollow through the wheat? Ah, that was where they hauled the guns that smote King Philip's fleet. Out of the Weald, the secret Weald, men sent in ancient years, the horseshoe red at Flodden Field, the arrows at Poitiers. See you our little mill that clacks so busy by the brook? She's ground her corn and paid her tax ever since Doomsday Book. Now, one line there, the last line, ever since Doomsday Book. In fact, the Doomsday Book, 1086, records 2,664 mills in England, but not Park Mill.
Next, Richard Howell will tell us of the background to the story Below the Mill Dam, and also read the opening paragraphs of it.
On June the 21st, 1902, just 11 days after the Kiplings had exchanged contracts on Bateman's, Carrie recorded in her diary, Rudd starts a story about Doomsday Book and a watermill. This would be the first story that he wrote with Bateman's as a background, and of course it became known as Below the Mill Dam. And it tells the story of a cat and a rat who live below the water wheel of a watermill. It's reasonable to assume that the idea for using the watermill and its outdated technology as a background to the story arose from the purchase of Bateman's. However, the idea of featuring a cat and a rat who lives below the mill would have almost certainly come from a book about Burwash and its people that was written by a former rector of Burwash, the Reverend John Coker Egerton, entitled Sussex Folk and Sussex Ways, which was published in 1884. In this book, Egerton talks about the cynical attitude that many of his parishioners have towards politicians and their motives for entering politics. One parishioner tells him, "I be a miller, and I got cats and I keep cats. And one day I looks into a place under my mill, and there I see cats and rats all feeding out of one trough at my expense." Book, Doomsday Book. They were letting in the water for the evening stint at Robert's Mill, and the wooden wheel, where lived the spirit of the mill, settled to its 900-year-old song. Here Azor, a freeman, held one rod, but it never paid geld. Nun nunquam geldavit. Here Reinbert has one villain and 4 cottars with 1 plough, and wood for 6 hogs and 2 fisheries of 6pence, and a mill of 10 shillings, unum molinum, 1 mill. Reinbert's mill, Robert's mill, then and afterwards and now, tune e post et modo. Robert's mill, book, Doomsday Book. I confess, said the black rat on the crossbeam, luxuriously trimming his whiskers, I confess I am not above appreciating my position and all it means. He was a genuine old English black rat, a breed which, report says, is rapidly diminishing before the incursions of the brown variety. Appreciation is the surest sign of inadequacy, said the grey cat, coiled up on a piece of sacking. But I know what you mean, she added, to sit by right at the heart of things, eh? Yes, said the black rat, as the old mill shook and the heavy stones thuttered on the grist. To possess all this environment as an integral part of one's daily life must insensibly, of course, you see. I feel, said the grey cat. Indeed, if we are not saturated with the spirit of the mill, who should be? Book, Doomsday Book. The wheel set to his work was running off tenure of the whole rape, for he knew Doomsday backwards and forwards. Infurli tenuit abatia de viltuna unum, haidum et unum, virgum et dimitium, nunquam geldavit. And Agamond a freeman has half a hide and 1 rod. I remember Agamond well, charming fellow, friend of mine. He married a Norman girl in the days when you rather looked down on Normans as upstarts. And Amagon's dead? So he is. Oh, dearie me, dearie me. I remember the wolves howling outside his door in the big frost of 1059. Esse velda conrum nunquam guldum reddidit. Book, book, doomsday book. After all, the grey cat continued, atmosphere is life. It is the influence under which we live that count in the long run. Now outside, she cocked one ear towards the half-open door, there is an absurd convention that rats and cats are, I won't go so far as to say natural enemies, but opposed forces. Some such ruling may be crudely effective. I don't for a minute presume to set up my standards as final among the ditches, but from the larger point of view that one gains by living at the heart of things, it seems for a rule of life a little overstrained. Why? Because some of your associates have, shall I say, liberal views on the ultimate destination of a sack of middlings, don't they call them? Something of that sort, said the black rat, a most sharp and sweet-toothed judge of everything ground in the mill for the last 3 years.
So this is as far as our tour is going to go in this direction in the grounds of Bateman's. Behind me here is a path which, if you follow it for half a mile or so, will take you to the old site of Burwash Forge, which little today survives other than a bank of sort of old cinder. But Kipling wrote about the forge in How the Draft, and I'm just going to read you a little text from it. Dan and Una perched themselves a row on the old hacked oak bench in Linden's garden, looking across the valley of the brook at the fern-covered dimples and hollows of the forge behind Hobden's cottage. The old man was cutting a faggot in his garden by the hives. It was quite a second after his chopper fell that the chump of the blow reached their lazy ears. "Eh, yeah," said Hal, "I mind when that old gaffer stands was Nether Forge. Master John Collins' foundry. Many a night as his big trip hammer shook me in my bed here, boom bitty. If the wind was east, I could hear Master Tom Collins' forge at Stocken's, answering his brother, boom oop. And midway between, Sir John Pelham's sledgehammers at Brightling would strike in like a pack of scholars, and hick hike hock, they'd say, hick hike hock, till I fell asleep. Yes, the valley was as full of forges and fineries as a May shore of cuckoos, all gone to grass now." "What do they make?" said Dan. "Guns for the king's ships, and for others, serpentines and cannons mostly. When the guns were cast, down would come the king's officers and take our plough oxen to haul them to the coast. Look, here's one of the first and finest craftsmen of the sea." He fluttered back a page of his book and showed them a young man's head. Underneath was written, "Sebastianus. He came down with a king's order on Master John Collins for 20 serpentines, wicked little cannons they be, to furnish a venture of ships." Next, we heard something about the Bateman's estate from Len Burnamont, the estate manager.
Right, so I'm Len Burnamont. I'm the garden and outdoors manager for Bateman's and Bateman Castle. Also normally the head gardener. So I look after the garden and the estate and manage the team. So where we are stood at this moment in time is by the mill pond. It's had a sort of checkered history since Kipling sort of gave the property to the National Trust. Most recently we've had to do a full-scale restoration of the mill pond after it was destroyed during some construction work. Machine managed to fall into the pond, and we found when we emptied it that the wall was actually just being held up by thin air. So the whole wall has been replaced. It's been done sympathetically and as close to the way it originally was during Kipling's time. So the render that was being put on by the National Trust was removed as part of the conservation work. And it also retains more water than it used to, so that actually supports our millers as well when they're doing their milling. We can mill hopefully more often, and we're conserving water. And it's a nice stopping point on the sort of walk that we encourage our visitors to make around the estate, to really experience the place as it was during Kipling's time. We manage the estate very much as it was managed during Kipling's time. Very low intensity cattle grazing, which is the way I think Kipling had it. Our tenant farmer is very sympathetic to the landscape, so as you walk out you can still see some of the locations that Kipling mentioned in some of his books. For instance, we've got the fairy ring in Long Slip Meadow. You can go and see that. There's no fairy ring, but you can see the location where he described it, as well as other locations like the Otter Pool as well. And these are all sort of elements that we maintain and we manage within the landscape. And it's a very ancient historic landscape. The iron industry that was here previous to Kipling, and that he sort of delved into and tried to understand himself, all of the stories and the legends that he absorbed, they do still come to life in a way in this old ancient landscape. And if you follow our sort of walks through the landscape, you can find them for yourself.
Heading back towards the house, we paused by the bridge over the River Dudwell to hear more about this part of the garden.
So we've paused in the wild garden, walking over the River Dudwell, the gentle brook that Kipling discovered in his garden. Although he found to his cost that it wasn't always as gentle as it appears today. The quote being that there's a river at the bottom of my garden, and sometimes my garden's at the bottom of the river, and that is indeed the case when the river floods during winter time, and even sometimes now with climate change and things like that, it will flood during summer as well, and that poses a challenge for the conservation of this area. But we do manage this space very sympathetically, again as Kipling had it. Originally it was part of the estate, and then he tried to incorporate this area as the beautiful walk down to his beloved mill. Some of the ornamental trees, the old cherries here, we believe would have been his original plantings. He did love Japan, and he was enthused by his visits to Japan and would have wanted to bring some of that back into the garden. It's a carpet of bulbs, and he talks about enjoying the bulbs in spring, so everything is very much in keeping with the way Kipling would have gardened here, but it's all very natural as well, and that ties in with the whole idea of it being more of a romantic arts and crafts garden that we feel he was influenced by. As well as being an extravaganza of colour during spring, we allow this wild garden to become much more naturalistic during summer as well, and it's there to reflect and sort of blend the boundaries with the wider estate. The hay meadows, so sympathetically managed, become one with the wildflowers and the long grass in the wild garden. And it's usually sometime during July or August that we'll then take a hay cut, and we remove all of the grass, trying to reduce the vigour of the grass to allow more wildflowers to grow in this space. And we'll take the grass out onto the estate, and then the farmer bales it. So we're constantly recycling what we use, and really trying to blur that boundary between what is the formal and the informal.
Just around the corner from the bridge are 4 pet graves. Little is known about them other than that 2 bear the inscriptions Wop and Kate. Wop was an Aberdeen Terrier Kipling acquired in 1925. It was reportedly the model for Boots in Thy Servant a Dog. About Kate, nothing is now known. While we're here, I'd like to read from one of Kipling's best-known poems about dogs, The Power of the Dog. There is sorrow enough in the natural way for men and women to fill our day, and when we're certain of sorrow in store, why do we always arrange for more? Brothers and sisters, I bid you beware of giving your heart to a dog to tear. Buy a pup and your money will buy love unflinching that cannot lie, perfect passion and worship fed by a kick in the ribs or a pat on the head. Nevertheless, it is hardly fair to risk your heart for a dog to tear. When the 14 years which nature permits are closing in asthma or tumour or fits, and the vet's unspoken prescription runs to lethal chambers or loaded guns, then you will find it's your own affair, but you've given your heart to a dog to tear. When the body that lived at your single will, with its whimper of welcome is stilled, how still? When the spirit that answered your every mood is gone, wherever it goes, for good, you will discover how much you care, and will give your heart to a dog to tear. We've sorrow enough in the natural way when it comes to burying Christian clay. Our loves are not given, but only lent at compound interest of cent per cent. Though it is not always the case, I believe, the longer we've kept them, the more we do grieve. For when debts are payable right or wrong, a short-term loan is as bad as a long. So why, in heaven, before we're there, should we give our hearts to a dog to tear? Our exploration continued in the quarry garden, just across Bateman's Lane from the house. Here is a memorial shelter built to honour Kipling's daughter Elsie after her death. Richard told us of the history of the house and the Kipling's acquisition of the estate.
I'm standing here in the quarry garden at Bateman's, which is situated about 50 or 60 yards from the main house. And of course, this is where the stone for the house was probably originally quarried. And in the 1890s, it was built and bought by a London stockbroker called Alexander Scrimger. And this was the man who the Kiplings would buy the house from in 1902. They had, of course, seen it in 1900, fell in love with it, but thought about it. But by the time they went back, he'd let the house out to tenants, but it came back on the market in 1902 and they snapped it up. And they bought with the house the mill, which we've just visited, and the gardens, and a field of 25 acres. So in total about 33 acres. So within a year though of having bought Bateman's, the Kiplings started to expand the estate from its original 33 acres. And this, it seems, came about through the publication of 2 volumes of books entitled Rural England, which had been written by Kipling's great friend Rider Haggard. And this was a survey of agriculture through Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. And Haggard was concerned that we weren't producing enough food as a nation, that we relied totally on imports, and he was worried that by being so reliant on imports, if there was a war in Europe, which he says in the book will happen one day, we won't be able to feed ourselves. And it seems as though the Kiplings took him up on this and thought, well, we've only got 33 acres, we can't produce much with 33 acres, and they started to expand the estate. The first acquisition was called Rye Green Farm, which they bought the year after they bought Bateman's. This was in 1903. By chance it happened to come on the market, and they snapped it up. They paid £650 for the farm of 50 acres, plus about £250 for the timber. So that worked out at about £13 an acre, and that included the buildings. And that was the state of British agriculture at that stage. It was suffering this deep depression. They then went away to South Africa, and it seems while they're in South Africa, they thought, well, if we want to expand our estate even further, it's no good hoping the properties will come up on the market. We're going to have to go direct to the owners themselves and perhaps be prepared to pay over the odds. And this is what they did. And they started to buy up fields around Bateman's. And in 1904, Rider Haggard visited them for the first time, and it seems that while he was there, he had a conversation with Kipling about the possibility of buying Dudwell Farm, which is adjoining Bateman's, and that was still owned by Alexander Scrimger, the man whom they'd bought Bateman's from just a couple of years before. At the time they bought Bateman's, I don't think Scrimger knew who the people buying it were, but by this time, of course, he knew the Kiplings had bought it. He was driving a hard bargain. They finished up buying 70 acres off Scrimger for £7,000, which was something like £100 an acre, when the going rate elsewhere in the area was about £12 an acre. And they bought other properties as well, adjoining the estate. And by 1906, they had accumulated about just over 250 acres. Caroline Kipling did continue to buy land. She had bought the first farm, Rye Green Farm, in 1903 with her own money. And over the following years, she added to that, so it increased in size from just over 50 acres. By the time she made the last purchase in 1928, she had 100 acres. So the total estate covered into about 330 acres, of which Caroline had bought about just over 100 acres with her own money. And of course, that was what the National Trust acquired in 1939 when Caroline died, and she passed the house and the estate to the National Trust. But the history of Bateman's all dates back to here.
Len then told us of the modern day management of the estate.
So today the estate comprises just over 300 acres, and that's all the land that the Kiplings bought during their time here. It extends all the way up to Pook's Hill itself in the distance behind me, and it extends out to Dudwell Farm to the east and to the west out and also up towards the A265. So it's a large estate. It's still managed, as I said previously, it was managed as a cattle farm. Lots of pasture, lots of grazing, some hay cutting, and that's how we manage it today. Our one tenant farmer looks after all of our farm for us. It's very sympathetic to the landscape. We managed to maintain hay meadows, one of those dwindling habitats which we're really proud of. And it very much blends in with the scenery. The house itself sits within the garden, and then the garden then sits within this beautiful landscape. There's very little intervention that we need to do other than just to make sure that we maintain that landscape, protecting it for the future, and also making sure that nature has the opportunities to thrive and breathe within this landscape.
Being in the quarry garden, we could not resist reading from Puck of Pook's Hill. First, Richard tells us why this location is so appropriate.
Of course, it was in the quarry here that really gave the genesis to one of Kipling's most famous stories, Puck of Pook's Hill. And Elsie wrote in Carrington's authorised biography of her father. She wrote an end piece about her memories of growing up. And she wrote this: "One summer in the early 1900s, we children and my father acted scenes from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Our stage was an old grass-grown quarry, and there my brother as Puck, myself as Titania, and my father as Bottom rehearsed and acted happily. A most realistic cardboard donkey's head had been donned by Bottom for his part, and the village policeman passing along the lane was amazed to see the familiar tweed-clad figure of my father topped by this extraordinary headgear."
Next, David reads the fictional version, which actually places the children in a different place on the estate.
Now the children were at the theatre acting to 3 cows as much as they could remember of Midsummer Night's Dream. Their father had made them a small play out of the big Shakespeare one, and they had rehearsed it with him and with their mother till they could say it by heart. They began where Nick Bottom the Weaver comes out of the bushes with a donkey's head on his shoulders and finds Titania, Queen of the Fairies, asleep. Then they skip to the part where Bottom asks 3 little fairies to scratch his head and bring him honey, and they ended up where he falls asleep in Titania's arms. Now Dan was Puck and Nick Bottom, as well as all 3 fairies. He wore a pointy-eared cloth cap for Puck and a paper donkey's head out of a Christmas cracker, but it tore if you were not careful, for Bottom. Una was Titania, with a wreath of columbines and a foxglove wand. The theatre lay in a meadow called the Long Slip, a little mill stream carrying water to a mill 2 or 3 fields away, bent around one corner of it, and in the middle of the bend lay a large old fairy ring of darkened grass, which was the stage. The mill stream banks, overgrown with willow, hazel and guelder rose, made convenient places to wait in till your turn came, and a grown-up who had seen it said that Shakespeare himself could not have imagined a more suitable setting for his play. They were not, of course, allowed to act on Midsummer's Night itself, but they went down after tea on Midsummer Eve, when the shadows were growing, and they took their supper, hard-boiled eggs, Bath olive biscuits, and salt in an envelope with them. The 3 cows had been milked and were grazing steadily, with a tearing noise that one could hear all down the meadow, and the noise of the mill at work sounding like bare feet running on hard ground. A cuckoo sat on a gate-post, singing his broken June tune, cock-a-cook, cook-a-cook, while a busy kingfisher crossed from the mill stream to the brook, which ran on the other side of the meadow. Everything else was a sort of thick, sleepy stillness, smelling of meadow sweet and dry grass. Their play went beautifully. Dan remembered all his parts, Puck, Bottom, and the 3 fairies, and Una never forgot a word of Titania, not even the difficult piece where she tells how fairies fed Bottom with apricots, green figs and dewberries, and all the lines ending in eyes. They were both so pleased that they acted it 3 times over from beginning to end, before they sat down in the unthistly centre of the ring to eat eggs and Bath olivers.
Finally, we could not leave before actually reading a little Shakespeare. Suspend your senses and believe Richard to be a fairy and John to be Puck himself.
How now, spirit? Whither wander you?
Over hill, over dale, thorough bush, thorough briar, over park, over pale, thorough flood, thorough fire. I do wander everywhere, swifter than the moon's sphere, and I serve the fairy queen to dew her orbs upon the green. The cowslips tall her pensioners be, in their gold coats spots you see. Those be rubies, fairies' favours, in those freckles live their savours. I must go seek some dewdrops here, and hang a pearl in every cowslip's ear. Farewell, thou lob of spirits, I'll be gone. Our queen and all our elves come here anon.
The king doth keep his revels here tonight. Take heed, the queen come not within his sight, for Oberon is passing fell and wroth, because that she, as her attendant, hath a lovely boy, stolen from an Indian king. She never had so sweet a changeling, and jealous Oberon would have the child knight of his train, to trace the forest wild. But she, perforce, withholds the loved boy. crowns him with flowers and makes him all her joy, and now they never meet in grove or green, by fountain clear or spangled starlight sheen, but they do square that all their elves for fear creep into acorn cups and hide them there.
Either I mistake your shape and making quite, or else you are that shrewd and knavish sprite, called Robin Goodfellow. Are not you he that frights the maidens of the villagery? Skim milk and sometimes labour in the quern, and bootless make the breathless housewife churn, and sometimes make the drink to bear no balm, mislead night wanderers laughing at their harm. Those that hobgoblin call you and sweet Puck, you do their work and they shall have good luck, and not you be?
Thou speak'st the right, I am that merry wanderer of the night. I jest to Oberon and make him smile, when I a fat and bean-fed horse beguile, neighing in likeness of a filly foal, and sometime lurk I in a gossip's bowl, in very likeness of a roasted crab. And when she drinks, against her lips I bob, and on her withered dewlap pour the ale. The wisest aunt, telling the saddest tale sometime for 3-foot stool, mistaketh me. Then I slip from her bum, down toppled she, and Taylor cries and falls into a cough, and then the whole choir hold their hips and laugh, and waxen in their mirth, and neeze and swear. A merrier hour was never wasted there.
After heading back to Bateman's, we drove up to Burwash Village, where we continued the tour outside Rampendine, a magnificent 1699 house owned in the early 20th century by Kipling's friend and correspondent, Colonel Henry Weems Fielding. There, David told us of Fielding's life and his relationship with the Kiplings.
Right now I'm standing in front of the house of Colonel Henry Fielding, an amazing man, a distinguished army officer, an explorer, a naturalist, and a man who explored the Arctic. He was born in 1838 into a military family. He joined the Black Watch and took part in repressing the Indian Mutiny. Following that, he went to, with the regiment, to China on various expeditions. After that, he resigned his commission and went to America to join the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. And indeed, he was made aide-de-camp to Robert Lee. He met and married his wife there. After the war, he returned to the army and spent a lot of time being sent on expeditions to the European section, really, of the Arctic. He did surveying. He was a great naturalist, and so he published numerous articles on the flora and fauna of the Arctic area, and he became really very well known. He was awarded the Polar Arctic Medal for his work in the Arctic, and he took part in the First and the Second Boer War. Leaving the army, he went to Norfolk, where he played a prominent part in the natural history of Norfolk. He was a member of the National Geographic Society and was proposed for membership of the Royal Society, which of course is the absolute accolade. However, he wasn't successful in the nomination. He came to Rapdean in 1902 as he had inherited the house. And he actually came with his wife, his American wife, on the same day that the Kiplings moved into Bateman's. And they became friends. They had so much in common, not least, of course, their American wives. Now, Kipling introduced Fielden to Rider Haggard, who was a very enthusiastic environmentalist and naturalist, and the three really became firm friends. They had, after all three of them had extensive experience in South Africa, and they formed a very firm friendship. Kipling in particular became very closely attached to Henry, and whenever the Kiplings went away, then the Fieldens looked after Bateman's in the absence of the owners. Fielden died in 1921, which means that they were friends for almost 20 years. And in fact, he died just 3 years before Rider Haggard.
Next, we stopped at the Kipling statue. This was unveiled in 2019 by the chairman of the Kipling Society and was made by Vicky Atkinson, a local sculptor, and paid for by funds raised by the parish council. It stands on a ground of red tiles, some of which have been imprinted with names from Kipling's life and works. Next, we visited the Burwash War Memorial, on which is inscribed the name of Kipling's son John. John Walker tells us of his history.
The clearest and the most special for this memorial is certainly the Lanterne des Morts, the light which is illuminated on the anniversary of each man's death. That's been continued from 1920 till today, with the exception of the times during the Second World War, when, of course, lights did not become part of a village's projection. The second is clearly the fact that we have John Kipling's own name. And immediately there's a problem for us as Kipling enthusiasts, because although he is correctly listed as Lieutenant John Kipling, he had been gazetted after his death. We can very easily see that on the monument it has the 29th of September by his death, and we know very definitely that he was listed as missing, presumed killed, on the 27th of September. There's a question for us which no one seems to have satisfactorily answered. Why did Kipling not have that just right for his son? The monument itself is Grade 2 star listed, and it is in the very best English limestone. The implication is that the work that went on from 1917 on in the village here must have been heavily funded by Kipling himself. The Etchingham Memorial, which he unveiled in April, had just 15 men listed. Here we have 63 from the First War and a further 14 from the Second. I'm going to read the piece which Kipling wrote for parents everywhere. Some of it is a savage summary of their feelings of the time. It's called The Children. These were our children who died for our lands. They were dear in our sight. We have only the memory left of their home-treasured sayings and laughter. The price of our loss shall be paid to our hands, not another's hereafter. Neither the alien nor priest shall decide on it. That is our right. But who shall return to us? The children. At the hour the barbarian chose to disclose his pretences and raged against man, they engaged, on the breasts that they bared for us, the first felon stroke of the sword he had long time prepared for us. Their bodies were all our defence, while we wrought our defences. They bought us anew with their blood, forbearing to blame us, those hours which we had not made good when the judgment o'ercame us. They believed us and perished for it. Our statecraft, our learning, delivered them bound to the pit and alive to the burning. Whither they mirthfully hastened, as jostling for honour. Not since her birth has our earth seen such worth loosed upon us. Nor was their agony brief, or once only imposed on them. The wounded, the war-spent, the sick received no exemption. Being cured, they returned and endured and achieved our redemption. Hopeless themselves of relief till death, marvelling, closed on them. That flesh we had nursed from the first in all cleanness was given to corruption unveiled and assailed by the malice of heaven, by the heart-shaking jests of decay, where it lolled on the wires to be blanched or gay-painted by fumes, to be cindered by fires, to be senselessly tossed and retossed in stale mutilation, from crater to crater. For this we shall take expiation, but who shall return us the children?
The final stop on our tour is St Bartholomew's Church. We're now outside St Bartholomew's Church in Burwash, a church which Kipling referred to in a number of his stories, particularly those in the Puck of Pook's Hill series, where it was known as St Barnabas. And I'd like to read to you, before we go in, an extract from Howler the Draft, which is set in the church tower, which you can see here behind me. Come night, we stole a tiptoe uphill to Barnabas Church again, a thick mist and a moon striking through. I had no sooner locked the tower door behind us than over goes Sebastian, full length in the dark. Pest, he says. Step high and feel low, Hal. I've stumbled over guns before. I groped, and one by one, the tower was pitchy dark. I counted the lither barrels of 20 serpentines laid out on pease straw. No conceal at all. There's 2 demi-cannon by my end, said Sebastian, slapping metal. They'll be for Andrew Barton's lower deck. Honest John Collins. So this is his warehouse, his arsenal, his armoury. Now see why your pokings and pryings have raised the devil in Sussex. You've hindered John's lawful trade for months, and he laughed where he lay. A clay cold tower is no fireside at midnight, so we climbed the belfry stairs, and there Sebastian trips over a cowhide with its horns and tail. Aha, your devil has left his doublet. Does it become me, Hal? He draws it on and capers in the slits of window moonlight. Wonderful devilish like. Then he sits on the stairs, rapping with his tail on a board, and his back aspect was dreader than his front, and Howlet lit in and screeched at the horns on him. If you'd keep out the devil, shut the door, he whispered. That's another false proverb, Hal, for I can hear your tower door opening. I locked it. Who a plague has another key then? I said. I hold the congregation to judge by their feet, he says, and peers into the blackness. Still, Hal, hear 'em grunt. There's more of my serpentines, I'll be bound. 1, 2, 3, 4 they bear in. Faith, Andrew acquits himself like an admiral. 24 serpentines in all. As if it had been an echo, we heard John Collins's voice come up all hollow. 24 serpentines and 2 demi-cannon. That's a full tally for Sir Andrew Barton. Courtesy costs naught, whispered Sebastian. Shall I drop my dagger on his head? They go over to Rye Thursday in the wool wains under the wool packs. Dirk Brenzett meets them at Uddymore as before, says John. Lord, what a worn, hand-smooth trade it is, said Sebastian. I lay with the sole 2 babes in the village that have not our lawful share of the venture. There was a full score folk below, talking like all Roberts Bridge Market. We counted them by voice. Master John Collin pipes, the guns for the French carrot must lie here next month. Will, when does your young fool, me please you, come back from London? No odds, I heard Ticehurst Will answer. Lay 'em just where you have mine, Miss Collins. We're all too afraid of the devil to mell with a tower now. And the long knave laughed. Aha, 'tis easy now if you to raise the devil, Will, says another, Ralph Hobden of the Forge. Amen, roars Sebastian, and ere I could hear him, he leaps down the stairs, wonderful devilish like, howling no bounds. He had scarce time to lay out for the nearest than they ran. Saints, how they ran! We heard them pound on the door of the Bell Tavern, and then we ran too. Moving inside the church, we go first to the memorial plaque to John Kipling, where John Walker tells us of his history and reads us a well-known Kipling poem.
Charles Nicholson designed the war memorial here, but when Kipling wanted to have his own personal family memorial here in the church at St. Bartholomew's, he looked to his friend Herbert Baker for a suggestion, and he proposed Charles Wheeler, a young artist who had just started working with Baker and was to go on and do all kinds of work across the field, and in fact was later to design the wall at Dud Corner on which John's name would appear. And here there's a story to the plaque which was put into the church, a church which Kipling had a loose association with. You may know that he paid for the Bateman's pew here at the church, but he seems rarely to have used it. He set Charles Wheeler to work, producing a plaque with the Irish Guards medallion at the top and a wreath of laurel leaves around it. And we understand that early on he was not happy with the laurel wreath as he found it rather loose. He said that John, as an Irish Guardsman, would expect it to be buckled tight. But much more seriously, as Charles Wheeler pressed on with the work, the very first casting was frankly something of a disaster. A hole developed in it and was hastily filled. And when Kipling and Carey saw it, they were not happy at all. In fact, apparently Kipling said, "Who did it?" And Wheeler explained it was an Italian craftsman. And Kipling said, "I don't know the lingo, but tell him it's bloody." Well, the final work is here on the wall, and very satisfactory it is indeed. It says, "To the memory of John Kipling, Lieutenant, 2nd Battalion, Irish Guards, the only son of Rudyard and Caroline Kipling of Bateman's, who fell at the Battle of Lewes, 27th of September, 1915, aged 18 years and 6 weeks. Qui ante diem peruit." The first point to make is that Kipling clearly wanted people to consider carefully the fact that his son had had such a short time, 6 weeks over his 18th birthday. and that, by some commentators, reflects his views on conscription and the possibility that if wider conscription had been available earlier on, then the early death toll would have been less for people like John. The other item to comment on, I think, is those final Latin inscription. Of course, it means something like who dies before his time, or dies before his day, literally. And you may have recognized it as part of a Newbolt poem. It's the poem Clifton Chapel. And perhaps Kipling wanted us, if we were Newbolt people, to recognize that he'd left out the next line, which is, sed miles, sed pro patria. But as a soldier and for his country. In May 1916, at the Battle of Jutland, HMS Chester was hit on the foredeck by a heavy round which burst up underneath the carapace of a turret. Most of the crew were killed instantly, and one young lad, a 16-year-old, who had been detailed to stand and be ready, was mortally wounded, but he stood and was ready. They took him back to Grimsby, and he died and was buried in a common grave with 15 others. But Beattie mentioned this boy particularly as an example of bravery, and the press took up the whole story with a will. And so 6 months and on from the loss of his own son, Kipling saw the papers full of the story of the ship's boy, Jack. A point for us if we're looking at the War Memorial, just underneath John Kipling's name out there is the name of a ship's boy of 16. There were many of them. For Kipling, the story must have been that there were so many families seeing lost children forever forgotten by the press. And so towards the end of that campaign, which ended with Jack Cornwell being given a VC and reburied with full military honours, Kipling decided he should speak for the rest, for all those who had lost a child and might never know where they were. Eventually it came to be titled My Boy Jack. Have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Has anyone else had word of him? Not this tide, for what is sunk will hardly swim. Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide, nor any tide, except he did not shame his kind, not even with that wind blowing and that tide. Then hold your head up all the more, this tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore and gave to that wind blowing and that tide.
We're now at what is known as Panama Corner in St. Bartholomew's Church, and I'll read you an extract from the conversion of St. Wilfrid, one of the stories in Rewards and Fairies, which explains why this corner got its name. Dan heard Una return and ran down to fetch her. She was standing by the font, staring at someone who kneeled at the altar rail. "Is that the lady who practices the organ?" she whispered. "No, she's gone back into the organ place. Besides, she wears black," Dan replied. The figure rose and came down the nave. It was a white-haired man in a long white gown, with a sort of scarf looped low on the neck, one end hanging over his shoulder. His loose long sleeves were embroidered with gold, and a deep strip of gold embroidery waved and sparkled round the hem of his gown. "Go and meet him," said Puck's voice behind the font. "It's only Wilfred." "Wilfred who?" said Dan. "You come along too." "Wilfred, Saint of Sussex and Archbishop of York. I shall wait till he asks me." He waved them forward. Their feet squeaked on the old grave slabs in the centre aisle. The Archbishop raised one hand with a pink ring on it and said something in Latin. He was very handsome, and his thin face looked almost as silvery as his thin circle of hair. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Puck's here, of course," said Una. "Do you know him?" "I know him better now than I used to." He beckoned over Dan's shoulder and spoke again in Latin. Puck pattered forward, holding himself as straight as an arrow. The Archbishop smiled. "Be welcome," he said. "Be very welcome." "Welcome to you also, O Prince of the Church," Puck replied. The Archbishop bowed his head and passed on till he glimmered like a white moth in the shadow by the font. "He does look awfully princely," said Una. "Isn't he coming back?" "Oh yes, he's only looking over the church. He's very fond of churches," said Puck. "What's that?" The lady who practiced the organ was speaking to the belower boy behind the organ screen. "We can't very well talk here," Puck whispered. "Let's go to Panama Corner." He led them to the end of the south aisle, where there's a slab of iron which says in queer long-tailed letters, "Orate Panama Giorne Colline," which is "Pray for the soul of John Collins." The children always called it Panama Corner. The Archbishop moved slowly about the little church, peering at the old memorial tablets and the new glass windows. The lady who practiced the organ began to pull out stops and rustle hymn books behind the screen. "I hope she'll do all the soft, lacy tunes like Treacle on Porridge," said Una. "I like the trumpety ones best," said Dan. "Oh, look at Wilfred. He's trying to shut the altar gates." "Tell him he mustn't," said Puck quite seriously. "He can't anyhow," Dan muttered, and tiptoed out of the Panama Corner, while the Archbishop patted and patted at the carved gates that always sprang open again beneath his hand. "That's no use, sir," Dan whispered. "Old Mr. Kidbrooke says altar gates are just the one pair of gates which no man can shut. He made them so himself." The Archbishop's blue eyes twinkled. Dan saw he knew all about it. "I beg your pardon," Dan stammered, very angry with Puck. "Yes, I know. He made them so himself." The Archbishop smiled and crossed to Panama Corner, where Una dragged up a certain padded armchair for him to sit on. That reading brings us to the official end of our tour of the Bateman's estate and Burwash Village. We hope you have enjoyed watching it. It remained only for the tour group to retire to the Rose and Crown for some well-deserved Sussex refreshments.